Hey, work from homers, Adam Schroeder here. We love bringing you this podcast, and thousands of you have proven that it's been helpful for you. But since time and online storage space aren't free, Naresh and I wanted to come to you personally to ask for your financial support through Patreon. Go to patreon.com/workfromhomeshow and help support the show. And we appreciate your support at any amount you choose. That's patreon.com/workfromhomeshow. Thanks for your support. Let's get to the show.
Forced to work from home by your employer? Laid off or feeling depressed at home? Do you want to make money working from anywhere? We'll show you how to do it from your couch. It's time for another episode of the Work From Home Show. Coming to you from their homes in Austin, Texas and Tampa, Florida, here are your hosts, Adam and Naresh.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Work From Home Show. I'm your host, Naresh Vissa, with Adam Schroeder, and today we have another awesome interview for you with #1 New York Times best-selling author of the book Blood and Treasure, Daniel Boone and the Fight for America's First Frontier, as well as the New York Times bestsellers The Last Stand, A Fox Company, A True Story of U.S. Marines and Combat, and the new book, The Heart of Everything That Is, The Untold Story of Red Cloud, an American Legend. So, Bob, welcome to the Work From Home Show.
Naresh, thank you very much. Nice to meet you. Adam, nice to meet you also.
Yeah, and the reason why we're getting you on the show is because we've touched maybe 2 different episodes on writing and making a career out of writing. And you're somebody who, as mentioned in the introduction, who has become a multiple New York Times bestselling author, and you've made a living writing. You've had jobs writing, and I believe now you are independent and just writing on your own. Is that correct?
That's correct. I don't know. My success, such as it is, might be more of a question of my longevity than my talent. I've been around for a while. So when my son has said to me, my son turns 24 next month, and he said to me, Dad, I've been thinking of maybe taking up writing. I said, don't do it. Don't do it unless it's writing for television or writing for the movies or
copywriting. We've done a lot of episodes on copywriting for business sales, advertising.
Those are the money making. You know what the most lucrative form of writing, of course, is ransom notes. But since my son's record is clean so far, I don't want him to go down that road. But
it also has the biggest downside.
I started as a newspaper man when newspapers were still a going concern. And so I was kind of lucky. I got in at the tail end. It's like being the last buggy whip maker when Henry Ford is still tinkering with the Model A. And then I went to magazines when magazines were pretty much in their heyday. And I spent almost 2 decades overseas as a war correspondent. Believe it or not, I was GQ's foreign correspondent. I'd be in the middle of a firefight with the Taliban, and other reporters would say, GQ, what are you doing? Fashion of Al-Qaeda? Well, what are you doing over here? So I kind of got in at the tail end of the newspaper magazine business. Not that they don't exist now, but the kind of writing I was doing, the kind of serious writing I was doing, I'm not sure. Well, you know what? I don't want to discourage anyone. If you think you can make a living at it, go for it. Go for it. That's my advice.
Well, how about you expand on that? So walk us through that journey. You said you worked for some newspapers, what magazines? How about you tell us your journey? Walk us through that journey.
Well, I began...
and how you became a multiple New York Times bestselling author.
Well, boy, that's a lot to get in one segment. I'll try. When I got out of university, I moved to Cape Cod because I heard there were pretty girls up there. And I worked for a couple of years as a commercial fisherman. And I played basketball in college, and I started playing in the Cape Cod Basketball League. And one day some editor walked in and said, we're looking for somebody to do a weekly roundup of the basketball league. And it was the middle of winter. We weren't fishing a lot. I was always broke. I said, what are you paying? They said, $20. I said, I'll do that. And I had journalism had never been my goal, but I started doing it. And I said, hey, this is a racket. And I moved to New York City. and I got a job as a copy boy when they still had copy boys bring me coffee, tearing the AP wire off. At the New York Post, I worked my way up to sports columnist. And then after 4 or 5 years of that, I just said, I can't cover athletes for the rest of my life. I'll blow my brains out. These guys are so boring. So I jumped to the Daily News and New York Newsday, where I covered the mob. And then I was luckily, well, probably not for a lot of people, but for me, I was lucky enough to cover the crack epidemic that hit New York in the late 80s. And then I always wanted to be a magazine writer. I wanted to write long form. And I was lucky enough to hook up with Men's Journal. And I spent several years with them. And then GQ lured me away. GQ saw a book I had written where I had lived in Alaska for a year with Air Force Special Forces. And they lured me away and said, "You want to go overseas?" I said, that's what I do. I go overseas. And so my first assignment for GQ, my first assignment for GQ, I was in Liberia. My second assignment, I was in Afghanistan, I'd say about a month after 9/11 occurred. I got shot on that. I got shot in the leg on that assignment. And then I just, I bounced, Iraq and Darfur and Sarajevo. I remember taking shrapnel in Sarajevo at one point. And then Men's Health came along, and they made me an offer I couldn't refuse. And they kept me going overseas. And so for 10 years almost, I worked for Men's Health magazine as their foreign correspondent. And finally, gentlemen, I have to admit, I just got too old from running away from people trying to kill me, shoot me. So
I was going to say, you went from like the boring athletes to the trying to get killed on the battlefront. That's a pretty big swing there. And I had written books along the way, and a friend of mine, Tom Clavin, who is now my co-author, we lived near each other. We don't anymore, but at the time we did. And he came up with a book idea, and I loved it. And I said, why don't we do it together? And it was Halsey's Typhoon. It was our first book together, and it made the New York Times bestseller list. And we've been writing together since. We do our one-offs. Tom did a wonderful gunfighter trilogy about the Wild West, the Old West. And I've written some one-offs myself, but Tom and I are just, we're a good partnership. I mentioned Henry Ford before. We have like an assembly line going. He's a wonderful researcher. I'm a pretty good researcher. I do the writing. You can't have 4 hands on the keyboard. There's got to be one voice to any kind of narrative nonfiction, what we write. And then Tom is also a wonderful editor. So we go back and forth, and the result is probably in your hand right now, Blood and Treasure, Daniel Boone in the fight for America's first frontier. Yeah, can you explain a little bit more about that, the collaborative process? Because, whenever people think about writing a book, I would imagine most of them are similar to myself, of the idea of writing it with someone else is really odd. I mean, having an editor is one thing, but having a co-author is kind of a different thing, because like you were saying, you can't have 4 hands, you can't have 2 voices in the story. So how can you talk about that process versus whenever you've written your own spinoffs?
Well, when we come up with an idea, and that is, people ask, where do you get your ideas? It is so serendipitous. We have our first book together, Halsey's Typhoon. Tom was working on a book about a commercial boat that went down off Montauk, and he happened to come across a few paragraphs about Admiral Halsey piloting the entire Pacific Fleet into the worst typhoon of the 20th century during World War II. We knew there was a book in it. But once again, he had written alone, I had written alone. How are we going to do this? So as it turned out, it kind of evolved into, let's both start researching. And we found, you could throw me into the Library of Congress or the National Archives looking for something, and I'll probably eventually come out with it. You might need a search party to find me, but Tom just has a knack. It's almost like he was born in a library. He just knows his way around. So when we write together, when we do come up with an idea, we decide this is our idea. If the people who we're writing about are still alive, as they were in Halsey's Typhoon, there were many sailors who had taken part in that disaster who were still alive. Our book, The Last Stand of Fox Company, about the Chosin Reservoir, there were many Marines still alive. Our book, Last Men Out, There were the Marines who were trapped on the roof of the Saigon embassy in 75. We interviewed 9 of the 11, or I did. We found that I have maybe it's because of my years overseas dealing with soldiers and sailors and Marines. I seem to be the point man when we interview people, but when we need contemporaneous documents, which we do, for instance, for a book like Blood and Treasure, there's no one left alive. Of course, it took place in the mid-18th century. Tom has just got a knack for digging up diaries and journals and contemporaneous newspaper stories. So we'll sit down together and kind of divvy up what we have as far as research goes. And then I'll begin writing what we call in a clothesline, which is really an outline. But we like to think of it as a clothesline upon which we're going to hang our story. And I might there's no rhyme, no reason. It's not like I'll do one chapter and then send it to Tom. I might do 2 chapters. I might do a section. But that very first clothesline, so to speak, will be filled with questions for Tom. Do we need more of this? I think we need less of this. Who is this guy? He seems like something we should really, we should air him out. We should make him give him a larger role in our story, in our narrative. And it goes back and forth like that for 2 years. And eventually the result is, yeah, this isn't too bad. And then, of course, we have a wonderful editor at St. Martin's Press who, because all writers need an objective eye. And I have friends, before it even goes to the publisher, I have friends who I have read the manuscript, and I trust these people. And they'll be critical. They'll say, no, my wife is, if you look in the acknowledgments of Blood and Treasure, you see, I thank our underground editors, my 2 friends, Bobby Kelly and David Hughes, and my wife, Denise McDonald. She'll come in and say, this is far too purple. You got to tone this down. Or look at this. Can you come up with a better way of saying that? This is such a cliche right here. So then we hone it even further, and then it goes to the publisher, and we have editors at the publisher, of course, who will make it even better. So it's really, really a collaborative effort. That whole kind of romantic vision of the writer living alone in the garret in Paris. I suppose if you're Ernest Hemingway or Edgar Allan Poe or someone like that, that is the image. But for the most part, especially writing nonfiction as we do, you need a team. You need a real team with you, not behind you, not in front of you, with you.
Regarding, so you said a few things about your journey, and that I have some questions on. You said you played college basketball. Was it Division I? Where did you play?
Yes. How do I put this? I was a white guy at the end of the bench. I was a very, very good.
You were the 12th man, but unfortunately it was for basketball, not football.
Yeah, I was a great. I'm not boasting when I say I was a great high school ball player because I was 6'3" and a point guard, and back then in the late 60s, early 70s, point guards weren't that tall. Most people 6'3" were centers. But once it got to the college level, the Division I level, I got in the game when we were 40 points up or 40 points down. But it was a wonderful experience. In fact, I played basketball my entire life, well into my mid-40s, when I found that I just couldn't get up and down the court the way I used to. Just kind of chronic injuries from a lifetime of jumping on hardwood wearing, Chuck Taylors or Keds. And but I'm still, despite my wounds, so to speak, the shrapnel and the bullet wound, I got blown off a helicopter in Iraq, and I had part of my spine compressed. I had to have it taken out. But I still play tennis twice a week, and I go to the gym every day, so it hasn't really listen, you reach my age, you're going to have aches and pains. That's all there is to it. So.
Which college was that?
Fairfield University. Small Jesuit school in Connecticut. Yep,
familiar with them. And look, I was the 12th man Indian guy at the end of the bench of my high school JV basketball team. That's when I peaked. That was my big moment.
Yeah, well, so then you know what it's like. We weren't up 40 too often. Mostly when I got in the game, we were down 30 or 40. So you know what it's like.
Yeah. And then, so what are some of the other magazines and newspapers that you worked at? Kind of the big names.
I named them all. The newspapers were the New York Post, the New York Daily News, New York Newsday.
And this was all sports writing.
No. Sports writing was the Post, and that's like I said. I got tired of center fielders telling me they're in the best shape of their life, or they're going to give 110%, or
Yeah.
some quarterback telling me that his legs, he's a 33-year-old quarterback who's telling me his legs feel like they're 23 years old. I just said, I'll go nuts if I have to do this for the rest of my life. So I got out while
That's
the game
surprising.
was good. I took a 50% pay cut. I was making, I don't want to say what I was making, but I was making a lot of money as a sports columnist for the New York Post. And I took a 50% pay cut to go work the 8 at night to 3 in the morning cop shop beat for the New York Daily News. And then I jumped over to New York Newsday, covered a lot of mob stuff for the Daily News. And then just kind of at the same time I moved over to Newsday, that's when the crack epidemic exploded in New York City and murders just shot up. So I covered a lot of crack murders, a lot of cop stuff. And but the further I went with newspapers, I was always kind of scouting out freelance magazine pieces, or maybe writing for the Sunday insert at New York Newsday's magazine. And I knew that's what I wanted to do, as well as write books. And
Yeah.
I was lucky enough to, fulfill my dream.
As somebody who attended, when I attended Syracuse University, graduated from their journalism school. Initially, when I went there, my goal was to be what you were, which was a sports reporter, a sports broadcaster, and work at those big name places, Newsday, New York Post. So you made it. I mean, you did what a lot of people aspire and still continue to aspire to do. So congratulations for that. Did you work with some of these well-known sports writers who I see on TV, Mike Lupica, Peter
I know
Vesey?
Mike. I know Mike well. I knew Pete Vesey. Yeah, Pete and I worked together. Harvey Araton was my best friend. Harvey and I started together the same night as copy boys at the New York Post. And then, of course, he moved on to become a columnist at the Daily News and then a columnist at the New York Times. He just retired 2 years ago. Yeah, it was a crew. I mean, when I see guys still work, Steve Serby was covering the Jets when I was at the New York Post, and he's still covering the Jets. Well, I suppose he's a football columnist now. But how he did it all those years, I'll just never know. But yeah, I knew that crew. I knew that crew pretty well. I still know them. I mean, I'm still good friends with Phil Mushnick. I'm still good friends with Harvey Araton. I'm still good friends with Mike Marley, who's not in the business anymore. He's a boxing reporter. But we're dinosaurs. We're dinosaurs, Naresh. Just, old and in the way. That was a band, and that's also our band.
Can you talk about finding your voice and how you figured out kind of what genre was going to be best for your writing style?
Well, like every other, I gravitated towards, well, of course, when I was young, I gravitated towards Hemingway, who doesn't? But then the generation that preceded me, especially in long form nonfiction, Hunter Thompson, of course, calling Hunter Thompson nonfiction might be a bit of a stretch. Depends on what drugs he was using at the time. Tom Wolfe, the new journalist. I never had any hesitation. I was an old school. You never put I in your story. I enjoyed putting I in my story. Now, it's not in our books, of course, but a lot of my magazine stories was how I encountered, whether it was an avalanche that killed however many in Alaska, or how I perceived this battle between the Northern Alliance and the Taliban, or how I saw the IRA when I worked in Belfast. That's another thing, too. All those hellholes I just named, you couldn't get a drink. At least in Belfast, you could get a beer at the end of the day. But the Muslim countries, you had to find the Australian army if they were there, because they always traveled with their own beer. But I did not shy away from first-person point of view. And, of course, I can't do that. I wouldn't do it in the books that I write with Tom Clavin. Although I did write one book a few years back about it sprang from a magazine story. And it was about an outfit that adopts dogs, trains them, and then places them with soldiers and little kids. It's called PAWS, P-A-W-S, Pause for People, the number 4, and Pause for Vets. And when I got back, I was working for Men's Health at the time. And when I got finished with it, they had a book division at the time. And the book editor saw me in the hallway and he said, let's have a beer. He said, you got stuff left in your notebook? And I said, yes. And I ended up writing a book called The Dog's Gift. And that was in the first person. But of course, the stuff I write with Tom is not in the first person. I wasn't there to watch Daniel Boone's oldest son, be gut shot and then tortured to death, or his other son, die in his arms. But when I was doing contemporaneous stuff for magazines, I often used the first person.
Great. Well, the last question I have for you has to do with the warfare and also working from home. So during your journey, during your career, were there times, because journalism has changed so much over the last 15 years, were there times in the 80s and 90s when you were working when you could just stay in front of your computer and make phone calls and put stories together, or were you constantly traveling on the fly?
I was constantly traveling. I was I was an okay phone guy, but I had to be out and see, even when I was covering murders for the newspapers, going into the South Bronx, going into East New York, going into Washington Heights, that was my gig, so to speak. I'm not bragging about it. I'm just saying I was better at that than I was making a phone call. I had all kinds of tricks to get detectives to talk to me, take them to certain bars that were chi-chi bars and have people make a big deal of them, and then they would open up a little bit. And you just have to feel your way through it. Any of the tricks I had in my day probably wouldn't work today. But to answer your question, that's a long-winded way of saying no. Now, writing books. Now, of course, Tom Clavin and I, my co-author, we do a lot of research. You mentioned The Heart of Everything That Is. That was another book. I spent a lot of time out in Montana, the Dakotas, Wyoming, in my little rented Ford Fiesta, riding 80 miles down a dirt road because I wanted to eyeball what the land looked like around the Battle of Crazy Woman Fork. For the Blood and Treasure book, the book that just came out right now, I followed Daniel Boone's trail from western Pennsylvania down to the Blue Ridge Mountains in North Carolina, and then across the Blue Ridge into far western Virginia, eastern Tennessee, through the Cumberland Gap. In fact, my wife flew down, met me at the Cumberland Gap. We spent a weekend in a nice B&B there, and then up into Kentucky, all the way to the Ohio River, because I like to see as much as possible what my subjects saw. I want to see what that bluegrass looks like. I mean, of course, there's now mini malls and highways, but you can find places anywhere where the earth, the fauna, the flora look today as they did 200 years ago, even sometimes 300 years ago.
Wow, well, that's great, man. Your life sounds pretty fun. Because,
I got no
well, at least it did. And let's talk really quickly, though, about the changes that I mentioned regarding the journalism industry, the writing industry, because I remember back when I was at Syracuse, Business Insider was a startup publisher, and they started recruiting like crazy from our school. And they said, look, we got a great job because you just sit in front of a computer all day and you scour Twitter and Facebook and find news stories and put together stories from there. And they didn't send anyone everywhere. Obviously, budgets have been slashed. So the idea of getting on a plane, staying in hotels, meals, all that stuff, it's not a part of the industry anymore. So what are your thoughts on the evolution of the publishing industry, and where does it go from here post-pandemic, where now you're seeing ESPN and people are in front of their living rooms doing interviews. You're seeing Jeff Van Gundy on ABC, ESPN calling NBA basketball games from his home office and not at the stadium. Where do we go from here?
Oh, I don't know. I'll tell you one thing I do miss. Of course, we all know the newspaper business is kind of taking it's in its corner. It's taking a 10 count. But I miss local newspapers that used to cover the town hall and the fire department and the local police department. When those go, and they are going, if not gone, that's when that's when the world is going to change. I mean, yes, the Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, they're good for what they are. They're wonderful newspapers, but they cannot give you the flavor. I mean, right now I'm down in a little town on the Jersey Shore. I used to live in East Hampton, New York. The East Hampton Star was a wonderful paper to find out what was going on in town. But now, as you say, they don't have the budgets unless they're owned by millionaires, and the Rattray family who owns the East Hampton Star is fairly well off. But all other, and it's not even local newspapers. I understand now. I don't know this, but from what I'm hearing, that reporters at the Daily News and the New York Post are being paid, subsistence wages right now. They're making $27K a year. You can't live in New York and forget Manhattan. You can't live anywhere in New York on $27K a year. So where is it going? I'm hoping that shows and podcasts such as your own will somehow pick up the slack, step into the breach. But do I know if that'll happen? I can't answer that question. I don't know.
Excellent. Well, it's been a wonderful interview with you, Bob. That's Bob Drury. The website is rfxdrury.com, rfxdrury.com. Check out his latest book, Blood and Treasure, Daniel Boone and the Fight for America's First Frontier. Also, you are the author of The Heart of Everything That Is, the Untold Story of Red Cloud, an American Legend, as well as a few other books that have become New York Times bestsellers. Bob Drury, any final thoughts you want to share with our listeners or anything else you want to promote?
Well, I'll tell you what, I'm right in the middle of researching a World War II book. If I don't get killed, I'll come back on your show when I'm done. How's that?
I think that sounds like a plan. You already survived a gunshot in Afghanistan, so.
All right, gentlemen. Well, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you so much. And to all our listeners, check us out at workfromhomeshow.com. If you have any questions, hello@workfromhomeshow.com. Email us, once again, hello@workfromhomeshow.com. Leave us a review on iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, Spotify, whatever podcasting platform you use. And until next week, keep on working from home.